We saw in the last episode that by 1750 BC, the number of people of Canaanite and Levantine descent had grown exponentially in the Nile Delta region. So much so that in many cities, such as Avaris, they may have even made up the majority of the population. As the authority of the kings of the 13th dynasty waned, several regions broke away from Egypt. One of these was the region of Wawat in Nubia, where many of the fortresses built by 12th dynasty kings, such as Senusret III, were abandoned and taken over by the ascendant kingdom of Kush. Though the Egyptians had interacted with the people of these regions since the dawn of their history, the parts of Nubia beyond the Second Cataract had never really been core parts of Egypt, but more like imperial possessions whose affairs the crown had sought to influence. The same, though, was not true of the Nile Delta region. Ever since Narmer had reunited the two lands of Upper and Lower Egypt nearly 1400 years before, the marshy but fertile floodplains of the Delta region had been an integral part of the country, and its gateway to Canaan, the Levant, and the lands far to the east. But by 1700 BC, the Egyptian king's writ no longer had any meaning in cities such as Avaris, where a new group of kings, who Manetho, as well as modern historians identify as the 14th dynasty, came to power. We saw in the last program just how little is known about this line of kings. But one thing seems certain by their names. They were of Canaanite origin. Most of them were probably the descendants of migrants who had come to Egypt in centuries past, looking for work, and had ended up settling in the land where they labored. But it's not this group of Canaanite kings who became so infamous in Egyptian history, but another described as fierce warriors who entered Egypt on chariots and came to conquer. In some texts, they're known as Amu, meaning Asiatics. But this is a general term and can apply to a multitude of peoples from the east. Later Egyptian texts called these conquerors Hekau Kasut, meaning rulers of foreign lands. Most of us today, especially in European languages, use the word Hyksos, which is the Greek rendering of Hekau Kasut. Whether Hekau Kasut or Hyksos, the term did not always refer specifically to just the rulers of the 15th dynasty, but often to foreigners in general, including sometimes Nubians far to the south. Just so there's no confusion, for our purposes here, when I use the term Hyksos, it'll be in reference to the kings, government, and the military units associated with the 15th dynasty, and not the general population in Egypt that was of Canaanite or Levantine descent. Most of the information that we have on the Hyksos and their takeover of Egypt comes from the writings of our old friend Manetho, as well as the discoveries of archaeologists over the years. According to Manetho, the Hyksos invaded Egypt from the east, ransacked many of the country's great cities, plundered numerous temples, and oppressed the entire population. His words, which were quoted by the historian Flavius Josephus, described the actions of the Hyksos as follows. Invaders of obscure race marched in confidence of victory against our land. By main force they easily seized it without striking a blow, and having overpowered the rulers of the land, they then burned our cities ruthlessly, razed to the ground the temples of the gods, and treated all the natives with a cruel hostility, massacring some and leading into slavery the wives and children of others. Finally, they appointed as king one of their number, whose name was Seletus. He had his seat at Memphis, levying tribute from Upper and Lower Egypt, and always leaving garrisons behind in the most advantageous positions. He found a city very favorably situated on the east of the Bubastite branch of the Nile, and called Avaris. This place he rebuilt and fortified with massive walls, planting there a garrison. Their race as a whole was called Hyksos. We have to remember that Manetho was writing in Greek about 1400 to 1500 years after the events he described took place, and, given the ancient Egyptians' general superiority complex and xenophobia, his sources were quite biased against the Hyksos kings, since all of the Egyptian literature after the rule of the 15th dynasty almost always spoke of them using very disparaging language. We also clarified earlier that the Greek word Hyksos comes from Hekau Kasut, which means rulers of foreign lands, or even just foreigner, and was not a specific race or ethnicity. Josephus had also interpreted the word Hyksos to mean shepherd kings, which gave rise to the popular theory that the period of Hyksos rule and the biblical story of the Israelites coming to Egypt may have somehow been related. As we just saw, according to Manetho, the Hyksos were able to conquer the northern part of the country without striking a blow, which, if this were true, indicates that the rulers of the mysterious 14th dynasty that had already taken over Avaris and other parts of the delta, if not exactly welcoming them, didn't put up much resistance. Archaeology seems to confirm this, since there's no real evidence of any damage to cities such as Avaris and other major population centers in the eastern delta region during the approximate time period when the Hyksos are said to have arrived. This would seem to indicate that their so-called conquest was not as violent as we were once meant to believe. Regardless, the takeover of large parts of the country by a distinctly foreign people was a catastrophic series of events that was unrivaled in Egyptian history. While eventually the Assyrians, Persians, Macedonians, and finally the Romans would take over the country, the Hyksos invasion was the first time in Egyptian memory that such foreign invaders had succeeded. By 1600 BC, they seem to have expanded the borders of their kingdom into Middle Egypt, near the site of Beni Hassan. These, though, are just sketches of history gleaned from the relatively few historical documents that describe what exactly was going on during the Second Intermediate Period. Because of the scarcity of such sources, the political history of the 15th dynasty is difficult to piece together. Manetho writes that the dynasty had 6 kings. The badly damaged Turin canon, or simply the Turin king list, gives the same number of kings and tells us that they ruled for a total of 108 years. Even if this is true, it doesn't really tell us much, as 5 of the names on the Turin canon are absent. Only one was preserved with any certainty: the last king, Kamudi. There have been several attempts to match the names given by Manetho with archaeologically attested rulers, but this has had mixed results. Part of the reason for this is that several of the dynasties that followed the 15th smashed any monuments, temples, statues, and any traces of the Hyksos kings in an effort to all but erase the memory and humiliation of foreign rule over Egypt. The longest reigning of the Hyksos kings seems to have been Apepi, who Manetho called Apophis. He ruled for about 40 years. The Hyksos, though, didn't control the entire country. Much of the south was still not part of their realm. The refugees and remnants of the 13th dynasty likely sought shelter in Thebes, but whether or not they actually set up shop there or simply faded into history by living the rest of their lives in exile isn't known. Manetho writes that another 16th dynasty popped up in Thebes. Like the others of the first and second intermediate periods, this one is no less confusing. Their identity is basically unknown, and it seems that each Egyptologist who's an expert on the subject has a different opinion as to who they really were. Some have said that this dynasty may have been made up of members of the old 13th dynasty who just reorganized themselves in Thebes and ruled the parts of the country not controlled by the Hyksos from there. Others have made the case that it was an independent Theban family that held much of the areas of the south while the Hyksos were consolidating their positions in the north. Then there are those who state that the 16th dynasty were vassals of the Hyksos and not really politically independent at all. In fact, they may have actually been of Canaanite origin themselves. Lately, though, the scholarly community seems to be following the work of Egyptologist Kim Ryholt and his reconstruction of the Turin canon to argue that the 16th dynasty was indeed a Theban one, but politically relatively weak. In fact, for about 20 years, there may have even been a short-lived but rival dynasty in the city of Abydos. How much power, if any, this dynasty had isn't known, and some have speculated that it may have just been a nomarch and his family using some royal iconography. But back to the 16th dynasty. Its kings were in a most unenviable position. With the Hyksos controlling Upper Egypt, and the Kushites now in possession of the Egyptian fortresses in Nubia beyond the Nile's second cataract, the city of Thebes was all but strangled from the world economically. Add to this natural disasters, famine, and constant raids from the Hyksos or their allies, and you had a city that was on the brink of collapse, let alone in control of its surroundings. One of the dynasty's earlier kings, Neferhotep III, claimed to have been a guide of mighty Thebes, who protected his city when it was sunk, while his successor, who went by the distinctly Theban name Mentuhotepi, proclaimed, "I am king within Thebes, this my city." Yet absent from such inscriptions are any mentions of jurisdiction in the territories outside of the city, let alone being the ruler of Upper and Lower Egypt, which is the title that a true king of Egypt would unequivocally, at least, claim to hold. And so, along with Thebes, kingship as a whole in Egypt had fallen on hard times. The opposite was the case with the Hyksos and their realm, which was flourishing due to a better climate and trade links with all parts of the world. The population there was growing, as was immigration from the east. In Avaris, there may have been more temples dedicated to the Canaanite god Baal than to the Egyptian gods, Osiris and Amun. The local markets were inundated with objects from the Levant, Cyprus, and even parts of the Aegean. Wine, metalwork, elaborately decorated textiles, olive oil, timber, fine jewelry, and objects made of gold and silver. Basically anything of value, whether a commodity or a luxury good, could be found in Avaris, or in one of the other major cities of the Hyksos-controlled delta. In a show of their status and influence on the international stage, the Hyksos kings exchanged gifts with the rulers of countries quite far away. For example, the name of King Kayhan has been found on stone bowls at the site of Hattusha, in what's today central Turkey. This is the city that would eventually become the capital of the great Hittite Empire. Other objects with Kayhan's name have also been uncovered at the ancient Minoan capital of Knossos on the Greek island of Crete. There are also the remains of Minoan-style paintings that once decorated the walls of a palace in Avaris. These are just two of the civilizations that we know of that were in contact with the Hyksos, and there are likely many others that we just haven't been able to confirm with archaeological evidence. Even gold from Kush ended up in Avaris via oasis routes that bypassed the section of the Nile running through Thebes. It was as if everyone was invited to the great party in Avaris, except the Thebans and the people of the surrounding